My family laughed when I said I was buying my first house at 28. They called it impossible, unrealistic, a pipe dream for someone like me. My stepmother, Patricia, smirked over dinner, telling everyone I could barely afford my studio apartment, let alone a real home. My half-siblings nodded in agreement, their trust funds safely padding their bank accounts while I worked 2 jobs just to survive. But what they did not know was that I had been quietly building something they thought I would never achieve. Today, as I sat in the real estate office signing the final papers, I realized they were about to learn exactly how wrong they had been about Serafina Matthews. Before we dive into this family drama that changed everything, I want to know where you are watching from. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness when it comes to family betrayals? Hit that like button if you believe karma always comes back around, and subscribe because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you will want to see how this family dynasty crumbles when the truth finally comes to light. Growing up in the Matthews household meant understanding your place in the hierarchy. My father remarried Patricia when I was 12, bringing her twin daughters Madison and Sophia into our lives. While I was expected to share my bedroom and give up my college fund to help with their private school tuition, they were gifted cars, designer clothes, and promises of inheritance that would set them up for life. The financial abuse started small. My part-time job money would mysteriously disappear from my savings account, which Patricia had convinced my father she needed access to for emergencies. When I questioned the missing funds, I was told I must have miscounted or forgotten about purchases I never made. The gaslighting became so severe that I started keeping cash hidden in my mattress, terrified to trust any financial institution my family had access to. After my father died when I was 22, the real fraud began to surface. Patricia, now the executor of his estate, claimed there was nothing left for me. She produced documents showing that my father had supposedly spent my inheritance on my expenses over the years. Expenses I had never seen a penny of. Meanwhile, Madison and Sophia each received substantial trust funds that would mature when they turned 25. I spent 3 years working as a night shift nurse while freelancing as a medical writer during the day. Every penny went toward building my future, but I could never seem to get ahead. My credit score mysteriously plummeted despite my perfect payment history. Loan applications were denied for reasons that made no sense. I was trapped in a cycle of financial instability that I could not understand or break free from. The breakthrough came during a routine conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked at the local credit union. She mentioned seeing my name on several large withdrawals and credit applications that had been flagged for suspicious activity. When I told her I had never made those transactions, her expression grew serious. She suggested I run a comprehensive credit check and review all accounts associated with my Social Security number. What I discovered that night made my blood run cold. Patricia had been using my identity for years, opening credit cards and taking out loans in my name to fund her daughters' lavish lifestyles. The mysterious disappearances from my savings account were nothing compared to the systematic theft that had been happening behind the scenes. My stepmother had stolen over $80,000 using my credit, my name, and my future as collateral for her daughter's comfort. The paper trail was extensive and damning. Credit card statements showed purchases at high-end boutiques where Madison and Sophia shopped regularly. Loan documents bore forged signatures that were close enough to mine to pass casual inspection, but clearly different under scrutiny. Most devastating of all was a mortgage application for a vacation home in the Hamptons, approved using my income information, but with Patricia listed as the sole owner. I sat in my tiny studio apartment, surrounded by evidence of years of financial manipulation and identity theft, and felt something shift inside me. The family that had convinced me I was worthless, irresponsible, and destined for failure had been actively sabotaging my success while enriching themselves with my stolen credit and forged documents. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to a credit fraud specialist who walked me through the process of documenting the theft and beginning the restoration of my credit. The second was to a lawyer who specialized in family financial abuse cases. The third was to a private investigator who could help me uncover the full extent of the fraud and gather evidence that would hold up in court. As I began building my case against Patricia and potentially my half-siblings, if they were aware of the fraud, I realized this was about more than money. This was about years of psychological manipulation designed to keep me dependent and grateful for scraps while they feasted on the fruits of my stolen identity. They wanted me to believe I was incapable of success, all while ensuring that belief became reality through their criminal actions. The investigation revealed that Madison and Sophia had been aware of at least some of the fraud. Text messages recovered from a shared family computer showed conversations where they joked about their trust fund sister never figuring out why her credit was so bad. They had participated in using credit cards opened in my name, making purchases they knew I could not afford and had never authorized. Armed with evidence that could destroy my stepfamily, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could confront them privately, demand restitution, and hope they would quietly make things right. Or I could pursue the nuclear option, full legal prosecution, that would expose their crimes to everyone who had ever doubted my capabilities or dismissed my struggles as personal failures. I chose war. The first step was securing my own financial future while building an airtight case against them. With the help of my fraud specialist, we began the process of disputing every fraudulent account and transaction. The evidence was so overwhelming that most creditors immediately removed the negative marks from my report and began investigating Patricia for criminal fraud. Within 60 days, my credit score jumped from 520 to 740. Meanwhile, my private investigator had uncovered additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of my stepfamily's crimes. Patricia had not only used my identity for personal purchases, but had also embezzled money from the charity where she served as treasurer. She had used my Social Security number to open business accounts, creating a paper trail that made it appear as though I was involved in tax evasion and money laundering. The charity fraud added a federal dimension to the case that my lawyer assured me would result in serious prison time if we could prove intent and pattern of behavior. We now had evidence spanning 7 years of systematic financial crimes, identity theft, and embezzlement that totaled over $200,000 in stolen funds and damaged credit. I decided the exposure needed to be public and devastating. These people had spent years publicly humiliating me, telling friends and extended family that I was irresponsible with money, lazy, and destined to live paycheck to paycheck forever. They had positioned themselves as the successful, generous family members who had tried to help me but could not overcome my personal shortcomings. The plan began with a family dinner invitation that Patricia could not refuse. I told her I wanted to make amends for my financial irresponsibility and ask for guidance on getting my life together. She practically purred with satisfaction as she accepted, immediately inviting Madison and Sophia to witness what she assumed would be my public apology and admission of defeat. 3 days before the dinner, I executed the first phase of my revenge. I filed formal complaints with the Federal Trade Commission, the State Attorney General's office, and local police, providing them with comprehensive evidence of the identity theft and embezzlement. I also contacted the charity where Patricia worked, presenting them with proof of her financial crimes and demanding an immediate audit of all accounts she had access to. The morning of our family dinner, Patricia received a call from the charity's board of directors informing her that she was suspended pending a criminal investigation into missing funds. She called me in a panic, claiming there must be some misunderstanding, some mistake in their accounting that would clear up soon. I expressed sympathy and concern, assuring her that everything would work out fine. That evening, I arrived at the restaurant early and arranged for a private dining room where our conversation would not be overheard by other patrons. I had also invited 2 special guests who would be arriving shortly after we finished our meal, Detective Sarah Williams from the Financial Crimes Unit and Agent Michael Torres from the FBI's white-collar crime division. When Patricia, Madison, and Sophia arrived, they were in high spirits. They had spent the afternoon shopping with money from credit cards I would later learn were opened using my identity just weeks earlier. They gossiped about mutual acquaintances, made snide comments about my outfit, and settled in for what they assumed would be an evening of my humiliation and their entertainment. I let them order appetizers and wine, listening to them discuss their upcoming vacation to Europe and Madison's new Mercedes. When they finally turned their attention to me, asking about my financial troubles and whether I had finally learned my lesson about living within my means, I smiled and pulled out a manila folder. "Actually," I said, setting the folder on the table between us, "I wanted to talk to you about your financial troubles." The mood shifted instantly. Patricia's face went pale as I opened the folder and began laying out bank statements, credit reports, and loan documents. Her daughters leaned forward, confused by the sudden tension in their mother's posture. "These are credit cards opened in my name," I explained calmly, pointing to statements showing thousands of dollars in charges at their favorite stores. "And these are loan documents with my forged signature used to purchase a vacation home I've never seen. And this is evidence that you've been embezzling from the Children's Hospital charity for 3 years." Patricia tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued. "I've spent the last 4 months working with federal investigators to build a case against you for identity theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The evidence is overwhelming, and the charges are going to result in significant prison time." Madison and Sophia looked stunned, turning to their mother for an explanation that never came. Patricia sat frozen, her face cycling through denial, anger, and fear as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had been so confident in her control over me that she had never considered the possibility that I might fight back with legal weapons she could not manipulate or dismiss. The silence in the restaurant stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Patricia finally found her voice, immediately shifting into the manipulative tactics that had controlled me for years. She claimed the documents were fabricated, that I was having some sort of mental breakdown, that my jealousy of her daughters had driven me to create elaborate lies to destroy their family. But this time, I was prepared for her gaslighting. I pulled out my phone and played a recording from my meeting with the FBI agent, where he confirmed that their investigation had corroborated every piece of evidence I had provided. Patricia's face went ashen as she realized that her usual tactics would not work against federal law enforcement agencies. Madison and Sophia began asking rapid-fire questions that their mother could not answer satisfactorily. How had they been able to afford their lifestyle on Patricia's charity coordinator salary? Why were there credit cards in my name that they had been using? What vacation home was I talking about? As the reality of their situation became clear, their loyalty to their mother began to crack. The first major alliance came from an unexpected source, Sophia, the younger twin, who had always been more thoughtful and less materialistic than her sister. She admitted that she had questioned some of their financial good fortune, but had been told by Patricia that my father had left more money than expected. When I showed her evidence that her mother had actually stolen my inheritance and used my identity to fund their lifestyle, she broke down crying. "I never wanted any of this if it meant stealing from you," she sobbed. "Mom told us you were irresponsible with money and that Dad had decided to redirect your inheritance to our education. She said you agreed to it because you wanted us to succeed." Her sister Madison was harder to convince, but the evidence was undeniable. Bank records showed that virtually every major purchase they had made in the last 3 years had been funded through fraud committed against me. The European vacation they were planning had been booked using a credit card opened in my name just 2 weeks earlier. As the truth sank in, both daughters began to understand that their comfortable lifestyle had been built on systematic theft from their stepsister. More importantly, they realized that they could potentially be charged as accessories to fraud if prosecutors decided they had knowingly participated in using stolen credit. The second alliance came from within our extended family. My paternal Aunt Margaret, who had always questioned Patricia's sudden wealth after my father's death, had been conducting her own investigation into the estate's finances. She contacted me the day after the restaurant confrontation, revealing that she had discovered additional evidence of Patricia's crimes. Aunt Margaret had found documents in my father's safe deposit box that proved Patricia had forged his signature on a will amendment that redirected my inheritance to her daughters. The original will clearly left me half of his estate, including the family home, and a substantial investment portfolio that Patricia had liquidated immediately after his death. With Margaret's evidence combined with my financial fraud documentation, we now had proof of crimes spanning from identity theft and credit fraud to forgery and estate manipulation. The case was becoming so comprehensive that my lawyer suggested we might be looking at federal racketeering charges if we could prove Patricia had been running an organized scheme to defraud multiple victims. The investigation expanded when other victims began coming forward. Patricia's crimes had not been limited to her own family. She had used her position at the charity to steal donor information and open fraudulent accounts using the identities of elderly contributors who were unlikely to monitor their credit reports closely. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, an 82-year-old widow who had donated regularly to the Children's Hospital, discovered that someone had opened 6 credit cards in her name and charged over $30,000 in luxury purchases. When investigators showed her Patricia's photo, she immediately identified her as the charity coordinator who had visited her home multiple times to discuss donation opportunities. The scope of Patricia's criminal enterprise was staggering. She had victimized at least 12 people over 5 years, stealing identities and manipulating finances to fund a lifestyle far beyond her legitimate means. The federal investigation revealed a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals, including elderly donors, young adults like myself who trusted family members with financial information, and charity beneficiaries who were struggling financially and unlikely to question discrepancies in their credit reports. As news of the investigation spread through our social circle, I began receiving apologies from people who had judged me harshly over the years. Friends who had questioned why I could never afford to join them for expensive dinners or vacation trips now understood that my financial struggles had been artificially created by criminal interference with my credit and income. My cousin Derek, who had always been Patricia's defender in family disputes, called to apologize for years of dismissing my concerns about financial irregularities. He admitted that Patricia had approached him multiple times requesting loans that she claimed were to help me through financial emergencies I had never experienced. The emotional support was overwhelming, but also bittersweet. I realized that many people had been manipulated by Patricia's lies about my character and financial responsibility. She had painted a picture of me as a struggling young woman who needed constant assistance, all while stealing the resources that would have made me financially stable. But the most significant alliance came from my half-sisters themselves. As they processed the reality of their situation, both Madison and Sophia made the difficult decision to cooperate fully with law enforcement. They provided investigators with additional evidence, including text messages, bank records, and even recordings of conversations where Patricia had admitted to using my identity for financial gain. Their cooperation was crucial because it demonstrated that they were victims of their mother's manipulation rather than willing participants in her crimes. It also provided prosecutors with insider testimony that would be devastating to Patricia's defense strategy. The turning point came when Madison found documents in Patricia's home office that revealed the full scope of her mother's crimes. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were copies of loan applications, credit card statements, and bank records showing that Patricia had stolen over $400,000 from various victims over 5 years. Most shocking of all was a handwritten journal where Patricia had documented her crimes in detail, apparently viewing them as clever financial strategies rather than serious felonies. She had written about manipulating my father's will, forging documents to steal my inheritance, and using my identity to fund her daughter's education and lifestyle. The journal entries revealed a level of premeditation and calculation that prosecutors said would make it impossible for Patricia to claim her crimes were impulsive mistakes or misunderstandings. She had planned and executed a complex financial fraud scheme while manipulating her own daughters and gaslighting her stepdaughter into believing she was the problem. With this evidence, my legal team felt confident that justice would finally be served. But as we prepared for what we thought would be a straightforward prosecution, we had no idea that Patricia had one final betrayal planned that would test every alliance we had built. Just as I thought we had built an unshakable case against Patricia, the foundation of my carefully constructed alliance began to crumble in the most devastating way possible. The betrayal came from the person I had trusted most, my own lawyer, James Richardson, who had been secretly working with Patricia to manipulate the investigation from the inside. The first sign that something was wrong came during a routine meeting to review our prosecution strategy. Richardson seemed unusually nervous, stumbling over details he had previously mastered and suggesting delay tactics that made no sense given the strength of our evidence. When I pressed him about his sudden change in approach, he claimed that new information had emerged that might complicate our case. That new information, he explained, was a series of documents that Patricia's defense attorney had discovered, allegedly proving that I had been aware of and complicit in some of the financial transactions. According to Richardson, Patricia was claiming that I had given her permission to use my identity for certain purchases and had only decided to pursue charges after a personal falling out over her daughter's inheritance. The documents included what appeared to be signed agreements giving Patricia power of attorney over my financial accounts, along with email exchanges that seemed to show my consent to various transactions. Richardson assured me that these were obviously fabricated, but he warned that they might create enough reasonable doubt to prevent a successful prosecution. Something about his demeanor triggered my suspicions. Over the following week, I began to notice irregularities in how he was handling our case. Phone calls that should have been returned immediately went unanswered for days. Documents I had given him for evidence seemed to disappear from our file. Most disturbing of all, he began suggesting plea bargain scenarios where Patricia would face minimal consequences in exchange for partial restitution. My breakthrough came through an unexpected source, my private investigator, who had been monitoring Patricia's communications as part of our evidence gathering. During a routine sweep of her phone records, he discovered multiple calls to Richardson's personal cell phone conversations that had been happening for weeks before I had even hired him as my attorney. When confronted with this evidence, Richardson initially claimed that Patricia had been trying to negotiate directly with him, which was not unusual in civil cases. But when pressed for details about the content of those conversations, his story began to fall apart. He had been feeding Patricia information about our legal strategy while simultaneously undermining our case from within. The extent of Richardson's betrayal was breathtaking. He had convinced me to delay filing criminal charges while secretly advising Patricia on how to destroy evidence and create alibis for her crimes. The fabricated documents that had suddenly appeared in her defense file had been created with his guidance using information about my signatures and writing style that only he possessed. Most devastating of all, Richardson had been billing Patricia for his services while simultaneously charging me for representing my interests. He had been playing both sides of a legal conflict while collecting fees from the very person he was supposed to be prosecuting. The ethical violations alone were enough to end his career, but the criminal implications were far more serious. My world felt like it was collapsing. The person I had trusted with the most important legal battle of my life had been sabotaging my case from the beginning. Worse, his betrayal had given Patricia time to hide assets, destroy evidence, and build a defense strategy based on inside knowledge of our prosecution plan. I found myself back where I started, alone, fighting against a family that seemed to have infinite resources and connections, to manipulate the system in their favor. The months of work we had put into building our case now seemed worthless, compromised by the very person who was supposed to protect my interests. The emotional impact was almost unbearable. I had finally begun to believe that justice was possible, that the years of abuse and theft would finally be answered with appropriate consequences. Richardson's betrayal felt like a confirmation of every cruel thing Patricia had ever said about me, that I was naive, that I would never be smart enough to compete with people like her, that I was destined to be a victim forever. But even in my darkest moment, I remembered something crucial. I still had the evidence. Richardson might have delayed our prosecution and warned Patricia about our strategy, but he could not make the bank records disappear or alter the federal investigation that was proceeding independently of our civil case. Sophia called me the night after I discovered Richardson's betrayal, crying, as she told me that her mother had been celebrating what she called her legal victory over dinner. Patricia had bragged about corrupting my lawyer and claimed that she would soon be free to continue her lifestyle without consequences. "She said you were too stupid to realize that money always wins," Sophia sobbed into the phone. "She said Richardson was just the first lawyer she would buy off and that she had enough dirt on people in this town to stay protected forever." That conversation reignited the fire that Richardson's betrayal had nearly extinguished. Patricia's arrogance and certainty that she was untouchable reminded me why I had started this fight in the first place. She had spent years systematically destroying my life while enriching herself, and she genuinely believed that her wealth and connections made her immune to consequences. I realized that Richardson's betrayal, while devastating, had also revealed something important. Patricia was more desperate than I had realized. She would not have needed to corrupt my lawyer if she felt confident about beating the charges legitimately. Her willingness to commit additional crimes to cover up her original fraud showed that she knew how strong our evidence really was. The next morning, I fired Richardson and reported his ethical violations to the State Bar Association. I also contacted the FBI agent handling Patricia's case to inform him about the compromised legal representation and the possibility that evidence had been tampered with or destroyed. Agent Torres assured me that the federal investigation had been proceeding independently and that Richardson's betrayal would not affect their ability to prosecute Patricia for her crimes. In fact, his corruption had given them additional charges to pursue, including obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. But I knew that beating Patricia in court was only part of what I needed to accomplish. I needed to rebuild my legal team, secure my evidence, and prepare for a battle that was now more personal than ever. Richardson's betrayal had taught me that I could not trust anyone completely, but it had also shown me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The war was far from over, but I was no longer the naive young woman who had walked into that restaurant months ago. I had been tested by betrayal and emerged with a clearer understanding of what justice would require. Patricia had won this battle, but the war was far from decided. My salvation came from the most unexpected source. Eleanor Davidson, the elderly woman whose identity Patricia had stolen, emerged as the ally who would ultimately ensure justice prevailed. What I had not realized was that Mrs. Davidson was far from the helpless victim Patricia had assumed her to be. Eleanor had been a federal prosecutor for 30 years before retiring, and she had spent the months since discovering Patricia's crimes conducting her own investigation. She understood the legal system in ways that Richardson never could, and she had been quietly building a case that would be impossible to corrupt or manipulate. When Mrs. Davidson contacted me the day after I fired Richardson, she arrived at my apartment with 3 boxes of evidence that took my breath away. She had traced Patricia's criminal network far beyond what my private investigator had discovered, revealing connections to other fraudsters and a pattern of systematic identity theft that spanned multiple states. "My dear," she said as she sat at my kitchen table organizing documents with the precision of someone who had spent decades prosecuting complex cases. Patricia made the mistake of targeting someone who knows exactly how these criminals operate. I have been building a federal case that will send her to prison for the rest of her life. Eleanor had discovered that Patricia was part of a larger identity theft ring that included several other charity coordinators and financial advisors who targeted vulnerable populations. The network had been stealing identities and manipulating estates for over a decade, with Patricia serving as one of their most successful operators. The evidence Eleanor had gathered was overwhelming. Bank records showed money flowing between accounts controlled by different members of the criminal network. Phone records revealed extensive coordination between Patricia and her accomplices. Most damning of all, Eleanor had obtained recordings of conversations where Patricia discussed her crimes with other members of the ring. But Eleanor's most devastating discovery was evidence that Patricia had been planning to disappear. She had been systematically moving money to offshore accounts and had already purchased property in a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Patricia's celebration over corrupting Richardson had been premature. She was actually preparing to flee rather than face prosecution. "She thinks she has won," Eleanor explained, "but what she has actually done is given us evidence of consciousness of guilt and intent to flee prosecution. These actions will eliminate any possibility of a plea bargain and ensure maximum sentencing when she is convicted." Working with Eleanor felt completely different from my relationship with Richardson. She explained every step of our legal strategy and encouraged me to verify independently anything she told me. She introduced me to other prosecutors in her network and made sure I understood exactly how the federal case would proceed. Within weeks, we had rebuilt my legal team with attorneys who specialized in federal fraud cases and had extensive experience prosecuting complex financial crimes. Eleanor vouched for each of them personally and had worked with them on previous cases involving identity theft rings. The new evidence Eleanor provided allowed federal investigators to obtain additional search warrants for Patricia's properties and financial accounts. The search of her home revealed a treasure trove of evidence, including computers with deleted files that could be recovered, additional forged documents, and detailed records of her criminal activities. Most importantly, the search uncovered Patricia's escape plan. Investigators found airline tickets for a flight to Costa Rica scheduled for the following week, along with documents showing that she had transferred over $600,000 to accounts in that country. She had been preparing to abandon her daughters and flee prosecution rather than face the consequences of her crimes. The discovery of Patricia's flight plan accelerated the federal case timeline. Within days, she was arrested and charged with multiple federal felonies, including mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 40 years in federal prison. Madison and Sophia were devastated to learn about their mother's escape plan. They had believed Patricia when she claimed to be fighting for their family's future, only to discover that she was prepared to abandon them completely to avoid accountability for her crimes. Their shock and betrayal became crucial to our case. Both daughters provided additional testimony about their mother's criminal activities and her discussions of fleeing the country. They also turned over evidence they had hidden to protect her, including financial records and communications with other members of the criminal network. The federal prosecution moved swiftly once all the evidence was assembled. Patricia's new defense attorneys quickly realized that fighting the charges was hopeless, given the overwhelming evidence against her. They began negotiating for a plea bargain that would reduce her sentence in exchange for cooperation against other members of the identity theft ring. But Eleanor and I had no interest in allowing Patricia to escape full accountability for her crimes. We provided prosecutors with victim impact statements detailing the years of psychological manipulation and financial abuse that went far beyond the monetary damages. We wanted the court to understand that Patricia's crimes had been about control and cruelty, not just financial gain. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants finished analyzing all of Patricia's financial records. They discovered that she had stolen over $800,000 from various victims far more than anyone had initially estimated. The scope of her crimes was so extensive that prosecutors decided to pursue the maximum possible sentence under federal guidelines. Eleanor's expertise and connections had transformed what seemed like a hopeless situation into an airtight case for justice. But more importantly, she had shown me what true mentorship and support looked like. Unlike Richardson, who had exploited my trust for personal gain, Eleanor was genuinely committed to ensuring that Patricia faced appropriate consequences for her crimes. As we prepared for Patricia's sentencing hearing, I realized that the betrayal by Richardson had ultimately strengthened our case. His corruption had exposed the lengths Patricia was willing to go to avoid accountability, providing additional evidence of her criminal mindset and lack of remorse for her victims. The investigation had also revealed the full scope of Patricia's criminal network, leading to the prosecution of 6 other individuals who had been operating similar schemes. My willingness to fight back against Patricia's abuse had helped protect other potential victims and exposed a criminal organization that had been operating with impunity for years. Standing in Eleanor's office, surrounded by evidence of Patricia's crimes and preparing for the final phase of our legal battle, I felt something I had never experienced before: complete confidence that justice would be served. The scared young woman who had discovered the first evidence of fraud months ago had been transformed into someone who understood her own power and worth. The day of Patricia's sentencing arrived on a crisp October morning that felt like a rebirth. I walked into the federal courthouse wearing a navy blue suit I had purchased with money from my restored credit accounts, my head held high for the first time in years. Beside me stood Eleanor Davidson, who had become more than an ally. She was the mother figure I had never had. Patricia entered the courtroom in handcuffs, her perfectly styled hair and designer clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit and the hollow look of someone who finally understood that money could not buy freedom from federal prison. She avoided making eye contact with me, but I stared directly at her, wanting her to see the strength she had tried so hard to destroy. Judge Martinez reviewed the extensive evidence against Patricia before delivering a sentence that exceeded our highest expectations. 32 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, along with full restitution to all victims and the forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. The judge specifically noted the breathtaking scope of manipulation and abuse that went far beyond typical financial crimes. "Ms. Matthews," the judge said, looking directly at Patricia, "you systematically destroyed the financial future of your own stepdaughter while enriching yourself through elaborate fraud schemes. You manipulated family relationships, exploited positions of trust, and showed complete disregard for the victims of your crimes. This sentence reflects the severity of your actions and serves as a warning to others who might consider similar crimes." As Patricia was led away in handcuffs, she finally looked at me. Instead of the defiant smirk I had expected, I saw something that looked almost like recognition of what she had lost. Not just her freedom, but the opportunity to have a real relationship with daughters who now understood the price of their comfortable lifestyle. Madison and Sophia had both testified during the sentencing phase, describing their mother's manipulation and expressing remorse for benefiting from stolen money. They had returned thousands of dollars worth of purchases made with fraudulent credit cards and were working to pay restitution to other victims from their own earnings. The restoration of my financial life was swift once Patricia's assets were seized. The vacation home purchased with my stolen identity was sold, and the proceeds were applied to my restitution. My credit score, already recovered, continued to climb as the last fraudulent accounts were closed and positive payment history accumulated. But the true transformation was not financial. It was personal. Eleanor Davidson had introduced me to a network of professional women who became mentors, friends, and chosen family in ways my biological family never had. Through their guidance, I had started a consulting business helping other identity theft victims navigate the complex process of financial recovery. My relationship with Madison and Sophia evolved slowly but meaningfully. They had moved into a modest apartment together, working entry-level jobs and learning to live within their actual means, rather than the inflated lifestyle their mother's crimes had provided. We met for coffee occasionally, building tentative bridges over the wreckage their mother had created. "I understand if you never want to see us again," Madison said during one of our early meetings. "We benefited from what she did to you even if we did not know the details. That makes us responsible too." But I had learned that holding on to anger was just another prison, and I was finally free. "We were all her victims in different ways," I replied. "The question now is what we choose to build from what is left." 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I received a call that would complete my transformation. The house I had been dreaming of buying was finally within reach. Not the modest starter home I had originally planned, but a beautiful Victorian that I could afford outright with my restitution money and the success of my consulting business. The day I signed the closing papers, I invited Eleanor Madison Sophia and my Aunt Margaret to join me. We stood in the living room of my new home sharing champagne and celebrating not just my purchase, but the family we had chosen to create from the ashes of Patricia's destruction. Eleanor raised her glass for a toast. "To Serafina, who refused to let someone else's crimes define her future. You have shown all of us what real strength looks like." As we celebrated, I thought about the scared young woman who had discovered those first fraudulent charges over a year ago. She had believed Patricia's lies about her worth and capabilities, accepting a role as victim because that was all she thought she deserved. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power and refused to accept less than she was worth. The consulting business continued to grow as word spread about my expertise in financial fraud recovery. I had helped dozens of victims reclaim their lives from identity thieves, using the hard-won knowledge from my own battle to guide others through their darkest moments. Each success felt like another victory against Patricia, and everyone like her who preyed on the vulnerable. My story had also caught the attention of journalists and advocacy organizations working to strengthen identity theft protections and prosecution. I had testified before congressional committees and spoken at conferences using my platform to push for legal reforms that would make it harder for criminals like Patricia to exploit family relationships and charitable positions. 3 years later, I received a letter from Patricia in federal prison. She claimed to have found religion and wanted to apologize for the harm she had caused. The letter was filled with explanations about her difficult childhood and financial pressures that had supposedly driven her to crime. I read the letter once and threw it away. Patricia was still trying to manipulate the narrative to position herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of years of systematic abuse. Her apology was meaningless because it came with excuses that showed she still did not understand the magnitude of her crimes. True accountability would have meant accepting full responsibility without justification or expectation of forgiveness. Patricia's letter proved that even federal prison had not changed her fundamental character or taught her genuine remorse for the lives she had destroyed. But her attempt to contact me no longer had the power to upset or manipulate me. I had built a life so full of genuine relationships, meaningful work, and personal success that Patricia's toxicity could not touch it. She had become irrelevant to my happiness, which was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Standing in my home office looking at photos of my chosen family and the awards from my advocacy work, I realized that Patricia's crimes had inadvertently given me something precious, the knowledge that I was capable of fighting for myself and winning. She had intended to destroy me, but instead had forged me into someone stronger than I had ever imagined possible. The scared young woman who had accepted financial abuse as normal was gone forever. In her place stood someone who knew her worth, protected her boundaries, and used her strength to help others find their own power. Patricia had lost everything she had stolen, and more, while I had gained a life richer than any trust fund could have provided. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that made you question everything you believed about loyalty and blood relationships? How do you think karma works when it comes to people who hurt their own family members for money? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below about whether justice was truly served in my situation, or if you think Patricia deserved even harsher consequences for destroying so many lives. If this story showed you that it is possible to fight back against financial abuse and win, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life justice stories. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with family manipulation or identity theft, because sometimes knowing that others have survived and thrived can be the inspiration someone needs to start their own fight for justice. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victim to victor. Remember that your family should lift you up, not tear you down, and you deserve relationships built on love and respect, not control and manipulation. Until next time, keep fighting for the life you deserve.